Okay, thank you. Thank you, Tita, for representing MDI and hosting this talk today. And thank you, Edgar, for IDRC's support. And I'm very pleased to be part of the MDI IDRC lecture series. Can everyone hear me okay in the back there? Yeah? It's loud enough? Okay. As Edgar mentioned, my background is both as an academic. I'm a labor economist at the University of Ottawa, and I work on employment issues in developing countries. But at the same time, I have one foot in the policy world where I have been engaged through a lot of country-level work, both at the World Bank and also in the kinds of activities that IDRC sponsors that Edgar talked about. So what I'm hoping I can do in my talk is combine some of the analytical work that labor economists do about employment with some real experiences I've had over the years at the country level actually dealing with difficult issues around job creation. And what I want to do today is really talk about how to think about job creation strategy. And I'm going to make three basic points. One is that countries have to be very clear on what they hope to achieve through their job creation strategies. Job creation strategies don't happen on their own. Many countries think that as long as they grow rapidly, and I'm aware that this is a period of rapid growth in Myanmar, but a growth strategy by itself is not a job strategy. So I want to make it clear that it's very important for countries to develop their own job strategy, okay, distinct from a growth strategy. The second thing I want to emphasize is that in developing a job strategy, it's critical for you to understand the dynamics of what's happening in your own country's labor market. So the role of data and analysis is absolutely critical. And this is something that IDRC tries to promote through its research. Hopefully MDI can make a major contribution through its work. And certainly in my work at the World Bank, a lot of it has to do with supporting countries in doing the analysis that's required to really understand what's happening in your own country. Because job strategies are not universal. There's a very strong element of country-specific strategies required. So that's my second point, that you really have to understand your own country. And the third point I want to make with respect to job strategies has to do with the fact that it needs to be a multi-sector approach. Ministries of labor, for example, cannot by themselves develop and implement a job strategy. Ministries of labor are important, but there are many other considerations that need to be involved, and I hope to be able to illustrate some of this today. And this often involves not only government but industry and workers, but also other ministries besides the Ministry of Labor are often very important players in developing job strategies. So I'm going to try to talk for maybe 30 or 40 minutes today. No more than 40 minutes, because I know that I get very boring after 40 minutes. So I'll try to keep it to 30 or 40 minutes. And hopefully then we can have a very good discussion. But if during the course of my presentation there's something you want to clarify, something from one of the slides, for example, that is not totally clear, please feel free to ask me a question to clarify. And I really hope that the effectiveness of this lecture will really depend a lot on the kind of discussion that the slides I show generate in terms of your own questions and our own discussion. So I'm going to cover 5 things today in my talk. The first has to do broadly with how job creation fits into development. And here, as Edgar mentioned, I was one of the authors of the World Bank's World Development Report on Jobs in 2013. And they developed a very holistic framework to thinking about jobs. So I'm just going to briefly talk about that as the starting point for my lecture. And then I've been already mentioned the word job many, many times, so I want to spend a few minutes talking about what do we mean when we talk about a job, and what is a good job? Because often I think we have preconceptions about what a good job is, and that can really differ depending on the country context. Then I'm going to get into the policy area. And again, going back to the World Development Report, we developed what we call a policy triangle to illustrate the key components of a job strategy. And I'm going to talk about this policy triangle. But then I'm going to really focus on country-specific priorities. A job strategy in Myanmar is going to look very different than a job strategy in Singapore, which is going to look very different than a job strategy in my own country, Canada, for example. So I want to talk a little bit about country-specific priorities. And then finally, if we have time, I've been doing a little bit of work on the particular question of labor force participation of women, which is seems like a separate topic, but if I have time to summarize our work in that area, I'm going to do it. First of all, because the participation of women is a very important part of job strategies in the first place. But second of all, I think it illustrates a couple of things that I hope, be able to communicate as messages of my talk. One is the usefulness of data and analysis in generating effective policy solutions. And second of all, this point I've already mentioned, that often the most important elements of a job strategy, in the case of women, for example, may well involve things that we don't traditionally think about as part of labor policy. Okay? So that's just a quick roadmap to what I'm going to talk about today. So let me get started with the World Bank framework. So in the World Development Report, we tried to make one major point, and that is that job creation is absolutely critical for development. And in a sense, this is obvious. Whatever countries I've worked in, policymakers want advice on how to create jobs. They're very conscious of the fact that to meet the needs of their citizens, job creation is one of the most important things they need to do. And there are many, many different ways that an effective job creation strategy can contribute to a country's development. Certainly, living standards. Obviously, earnings are the most important source of income for almost all households, so the extent to which you can develop jobs that have high levels of earnings, you're going to contribute to a country's living standards. Jobs also contribute to productivity because there's an enormous learning process that goes on when people work. And the more people are engaged in jobs that allow them to learn, develop further, pick up additional skills, the more that is going to contribute to a country's economic development, productivity, and growth. And the third thing that labor economists don't typically talk about, but we emphasize a lot in the World Development Report, is the relationship between jobs and social cohesion. That by participating in the labor market, by working in activities that contribute to the development of a country, people get involved in the mainstream of the social and economic current of the country. And much of the problem, for example, in many countries with young people now, we can directly link to the fact that there aren't employment opportunities and they don't feel like they can benefit from or contribute to the social and economic mainstream of society. So when people participate in the labor market in jobs that they value, they tend to become more engaged in the communities they're involved in. They tend to develop stronger connections with the country's institutions. They tend to value their participation in the society and contribute more to the society more than people who always remain on the outside of the labor market. So as a starting point, I just want to underline, and this is something I'm sure everyone in this room already believes in, but I want to underline the importance of jobs, not only as a way that people achieve the living standards they need, but the impacts of jobs are much more widespread than that. Now, so I've talked about jobs. I want to talk a little bit about what we mean by a job. And a lot of times when we think about jobs, we're thinking about a wage employment position where you're composition of employment is very, very different. And this is an important starting point for thinking about what a job is and what kind of strategies we need to improve people's working lives. So in Europe and Central Asia, for example, it's true that when we think about a job, for the vast majority of the labor force, that is a wage employment job. People are working for an employer for a regular wage or salary. But when we go to some regions like East Asia and Pacific, which is the region that Myanmar is in, that wage employment sector is much smaller. And important segments of the labor force are either working in farming or are working in self-employment. And but specifically for Myanmar, here I'm using data from the World Bank. They have a upcoming report on jobs in Myanmar. They have some data where they have broken down the working population in detail, depending on exactly what it is people are doing. And here's the breakdown for Myanmar based on the 2015 survey on poverty and living standards. And again, this is the first point I want to make, that you need to have empirical evidence in order to start to think about what the labor market looks like and ultimately what policies are going to address the issues that people need to address. So in Myanmar, I'm just organizing the distribution of employment into three broad categories. The first is the percentage of the workforce that's in family farming. So this is not including agricultural workers who are in wage employment for an agricultural employer. These are people working on family farms. And that's over a third of the working population, 35% of the population. The second group, up in the upper left-hand corner, are people who are working in household businesses, but not in agriculture. And that's 26%. So when we think about wage employees, and I'm including people who are working in wage relationships in agriculture, that's only 40% of the workforce, 39% of the workforce. So this traditional notion we have of a job being earning a wage or a salary from an employer only describes the situation for 39% of the working population in Myanmar. So as we think about job strategies, we need to think about the fact that 60% of the people in this country are not working in that type of employment relationship. But the jobs they have are equally valuable, and in some cases the jobs they have may even be better than the traditional notion of a wage employment job. So let me turn to that.